All right, what is good? Deepak Chona, SportsMed Analytics, bringing you today's NFL injury updates. Thank you very much for joining. Now let's get it poppin'. Starting with Christian McCaffrey. So the data here is a little bit concerning. He's now listed as questionable. He went from full practice to limited to DNP on Friday. But that importantly, DNP on Friday, he was still on the field. He was just on the side on his own. Now that practice progression is a bit concerning, and the data on this practice progression favors that over 2/3 of players with his injury profile and that practice progression would end up sitting that week. With that being said, though, he was moving pretty well in the video that was released of the practice footage. So we would actually lean the opposite in the sense that we would lean towards him playing. He was already at a very elevated injury risk compared to his peers in the sense that the injury history, his age at age 28, 29 running back season does predict 2x the average running back injury risk for the season. This increases it a touch. Now, if he's active, in most cases, the 49ers have run him hard. And even when he came back from his PCL injury or his Achilles injury last year before the PCL injury, in that 4-game stretch, even without much of a ramp up, he averaged about 16 touches per game. So if he's active, we would suspect that this was just a precautionary absence. We wouldn't expect much of a dip, and it would confirm a very mild type of injury. But there's going to be risk here. You're going to have to follow this right up to the deadline of the 4 p.m. kickoff. And unfortunately, it is the afternoon slate of games rather than the early slate. So we'll just have to see with Christian McCaffrey. We do lean towards him playing, even though the data says the opposite. Then we look at Xavier Worthy. Yesterday, he had a big hit from Travis Kelce. It looked like a shoulder dislocation. You see the trainers on the sideline, and it suggested the way they were moving the shoulder that they were trying to pop it back into place. Very likely getting an MRI now. Most cases of shoulder dislocations do get a tear in this ring around the shoulder called the labrum, and some cases even fracture a part of the ball or the socket. The overall outlook in terms of his re-injury risk, regardless, is going to be high in the sense that if players in the best case return with non-operative treatment, they can return in season, but the average timeline on that is about 3 weeks, and then they do so with approximately a 50% re-injury risk. The shoulder tends to re-dislocate in young people, especially in contact athletes, and it's very much true of the football and NFL player as well. Now, if there's extensive damage or a large fracture, then in those cases, the shoulder is considered very unstable, very, very high risk. And the worst case scenario would be basically shutting him down for surgical repair right away. Either way, I suspect he ends up getting surgery, possibly this offseason, but we'll have to see when the MRI result is announced. Then you have Achane. So there was a lot of fuss about him in the past few weeks. The data here favors that he's playing likely without any dip. So the timeline that he missed, about 2 weeks, correlates with approximately a 10% re-injury risk, which is relatively mild. The hitting full practice before the game, before Sunday of the game, also predicts that he would be strongly playing this week. No workload limitation, no performance dip expected. Similarly, good news on Tyreek Hill. So the data here strongly favors Tyreek playing also without a dip. Similar to Achane, he was dealing with a soft tissue injury, an oblique in Tyreek's case, but logging that full practice prior to week 1 predicts a pretty low re-injury risk. The other thing to note with Tyreek Hill is that last year he was playing through a very serious surgical wrist injury for the entirety of the year. Now, did that affect him on every play? Probably not. But did it affect his ability to catch in traffic and also to come off jams and really just fight away defenders? Probably yes. So he's still fast, and we do suspect, if his mental game is right, that he could have a strong comeback season. Then we look at Malik Nabers. So he logged a DNP Friday, but actually doesn't have an injury designation listed. He was reportedly dealing with some back tightness, and this is his second time dealing with some back tightness this preseason, if you will. The plan for Malik Nabers probably is going to involve a lot of load management in practices. We wouldn't necessarily expect this to bother him or prevent him from playing fully in game. And the reason for that partly is he's a young player. He doesn't have a history of missing a lot of time. And despite that chronic toe and now this back that he's been dealing with this year, none of these are reportedly severe. So we're very likely seeing a strong Nabers as we come up this week 1. Then Jayden Reed, a little less optimism here, reportedly dealing with a Jones fracture. That probably would not have fully healed yet. If the reports are correct, then he's about 4 weeks into treatment of that injury and usually takes at least 6. The issue here is that if he is playing, and he logged 2 limited practices, so we would lean that way, we would expect him to have some limitations, both snap count and his performance itself. There's also going to be a high risk that this worsens the fracture by loading it, and every time you plant, cut, pivot, basically run any route for a wide receiver, this injury is at risk. Then Keon Coleman. So he is playing. The data here suggests no dip, and the reason is he was able to log a full practice prior to Sunday, and that implies that this was a mild soft tissue groin strain. The re-injury risk on this is predicted around 10%. He was dealing with this in the training camp area of the off-season program, but he wasn't really missing a lot of time. So we're suspecting that this is relatively low severity, but the recency of it is what gives you that re-injury risk. Then Stefon Diggs. So he's age 30 and he's a wide receiver, but coming off the ACL, the average timeline on this is about a 4-week efficiency and target ramp up. So week 1 and the early phase can be a little bit volatile. However, he does project for 85% of his pre-injury explosiveness and efficiency. So overall promising, but keep in mind that the first 4 weeks here may be a little up and down. Week 5 onwards, Diggs projects to hit his 90+% level. So that's very promising. Then we have Darnell Mooney. The mechanism, although it never was officially released as a diagnosis, the mechanism here suggests an AC joint sprain, and the timeline implies a higher severity injury. Even with that, he's logged 3 limited practices. The data would favor him as 2/3 chance to play. And if it is an AC joint injury, then we would be looking at a mild dip and similar re-injury risk. Then we have Isaac TeSlaa. So he had a lot of buzz this offseason, but the starting of this week, he had 2 limited practices. He was able to log a full session prior to this weekend. And with the illness designation and then logging a full practice, it's very rare to see any sort of dip in a player's performance once they hit that point. Then Jauan Jennings. This one has been a little unclear. How much of his absence was due to a re-aggravated calf strain, which started in OTAs and then was reportedly re-aggravated in training camp, and then how much of this was due to his contract negotiation. The data here does favor that since he's logged a full practice, that he would be very close to his pre-injury production level. We are still working on the assumption that the injury was at least in part real. It's unclear, again, if it was managed very conservatively just because of the contract, but we would plan for a moderate re-injury risk, about 15% those first 6 weeks back. Then A.J. Brown, now obviously not playing this weekend. He only had 1 catch this past game on Thursday. The question is, was this injury or was it just usage? And with the offseason hamstring that he had, yes, he was out 3 weeks, but he was really only limited from playing or practicing on the side on his own and for 1 to 2 of those weeks. So he was pretty quick to come back and at least start running drills and running routes. Now, with that in mind, we would suspect the injury was very low severity and therefore that it was unlikely to have affected him much in this game. Probably this is more a result of game plan usage and potentially even the Cowboys game plan. Then Matthew Stafford. So he's very likely 100% this week. The question with Stafford, he's had all these epidural injections, and of course there was some up and down in the management or expectations following his injury and the early part of his recovery in training camp. The question here is, can he hold up over the course of a season? We would consider this an extremely high in-season aggravation risk. If he rotates badly or if he gets hit, and he's not a mobile quarterback, so he's going to be very dependent on his O-line for that last aspect, the question becomes, is he likely to re-aggravate this? And there is very high concern from that end. I think using Devontae Adams, Puka Nacua on a per game basis in DFS, very reasonable. I have been avoiding them all off season for season long formats, but this one, I think week 1, there's nothing really to worry about. Then Khalil Shakir. So he had a high ankle that caused him to miss about 4 weeks in the offseason. He's returned, and most players, even once they return, do see a 4 to 6 week dip, especially for wide receivers. That average is about 20%. It's promising that he's practiced in full all week, and we don't expect to see his snap count limited. His target share will probably depend just on his explosiveness and various coverages, but in terms of his production, the average is going to see a dip. Then Cade Otton. So he has logged a full practice, had a very mild recent groin strain, didn't keep him out for very long. So we're not expecting a dip here, but keep in mind that he also had a preseason hamstring injury that kept him out a couple weeks. So the combination, meaning having more than one soft tissue injury in the preseason before week 1 even kicks off, leads to a pretty elevated injury risk for the first 6 weeks of the season. Then his teammate, Chris Godwin. So he's not practicing. This has been, of course, a topic of the offseason. We would lean towards a very slow ramp up. Remember, the Bucs gave him a long-term deal this offseason. And so they're not just playing for this year with Chris Godwin. The other thing to keep in mind is that we do typically, in the very smooth recovery setting, see a 12-month performance dip, and that would have lasted him up until week 8, and that dip is about 20%, so it's noticeable. With that being said, he had a second surgery. We don't really know what the indication for the second surgery was, and does that represent a complication, or was it just hardware that needed to be removed because it was irritating him? With that in mind, we would expect return somewhere in the week 4 to 8 range. And again, typically you would see a major dip from these ankle fractures when players first return, and with the second surgery involved, we would expect that to be even more likely. But eventually we would expect him to recover his ability. Then Christian Kirk. So he's out with a hamstring strain. The average timeline on these is about 2 weeks. So most wide receivers here would miss week 2. He is already out for week 1, of course. There's going to be a moderate re-injury risk and a little bit of a statistical dip usually upon the return. But with that being said, we'll find out a lot more about the severity of this injury and therefore the magnitude of that dip once he does return to practice. Then Brandon Aiyuk. So he started on the PUP. We are suspecting about a week 6 target return date. He had the ACL and the MCL, so not just the ACL alone. And the early phase of that recovery tends to be pretty volatile. So the average ramp up takes about 6 weeks. The last third of this season, he projects to be quite strong, but the middle third, the weeks approximately 6 to 12, the first 6 weeks after he's projected to return, that can be a little up and down. He'll probably have some flashes, but his target volume and snap count may not be all the way there, and therefore the consistency may not be all the way there as well. And then Christian Watson. So this was reportedly a clean ACL. It was late in the season though, and therefore the data projects him coming back late October, early November. We would expect a relatively rapid ramp up. It's important to note that Christian Watson has elite 90 plus percentile pre-injury athleticism. He is young. He certainly does have an injury history, and that's notable in its own way because his injury history is particularly relevant for a series of hamstring strains that in some cases were pretty severe. When you have the ACL injury, the hamstring is the secondary stabilizer of that ACL, so it kind of has to work a little overtime or it has risk of getting strained. And with that in mind, Christian Watson does have a little bit of elevated risk when he does come back that first 6 weeks. Then Javonte Williams. So he had 2 years ago ACL plus what we call the posterior lateral corner reconstructed. And again, that was year 3, and it usually takes about 2 years for players to regain their pre-injury productivity. We generally see a pretty noticeable performance dip the first 18 to 24 months back, but there are some outliers, and those folks do sometimes come back in year 3 a little bit stronger. Now, Javonte does fit the mold of those outliers who have a little bit of a delayed comeback. He is young, and with that in mind, he also was a strong athlete, but not a world-beating athlete. So that predicts that he would eventually get back. It just doesn't predict that he would get back to his pre-injury level super fast. So we may be seeing a real comeback year from Javonte Williams. We'll obviously have to kind of watch and wait on this one, but there is optimism here. Then Dontayvion Wicks, he's listed with a questionable with a calf injury. He's limited practice times 3 this week. Now, the data projects him playing at 2/3 chance, but there is, for a wide receiver, calf tends to be a moderate re-injury risk until they start logging full practices. So that re-injury risk and also performance dip varies around 15 to 20% on average. Then we see Isaiah Likely. So he's out this week. Jones fracture most likely is the suspected diagnosis. The data here favors a week 2 to 4 return, with week 3 being really the most likely. Keep in mind that the first 4 weeks of the return tend to be associated with a pretty noticeable production dip. After that, he is expected to get back to his pre-injury level. Then Micah Parsons, obviously big talk of the offseason. He has a facet sprain in his spine, but he did log limited practices all 3 days. So the data does favor him playing. Now, this may have to be managed at times during the season, but we would suspect it probably doesn't cause him a lot of absence. Then Myles Garrett, there was some buzz that he had an injury designation as he was DNP Thursday, but then he logged a full practice on Friday. He is actually known to have some veteran rest days in between there, so we're suspecting that's all this was on Thursday, likely no dip come this weekend. Then Vita Vea, so he was DNP'd the first 2 days of the week with a foot injury and then logged a full practice. So the data in that progression does favor him playing at about 60% chances. Then Dre Greenlaw, a little less optimism here. He's out listed with a quad. It's unclear what exactly his diagnosis is currently, but we're suspecting a quad strain is most likely. Typically, you would see a multi-week absence with this, and especially given that he does have a prior Achilles injury and he does have a little bit of soft tissue injury history. So with that in mind, we would lean towards him being out for a couple of weeks here at least. Then Jaire Alexander, now traded to the Ravens. He is playing. No dip is projected in this case. However, there were some reports that in the recent weeks he had his knee drained and or injected. Now, if that's the case, it suggests that there may be some source of inflammation inside there, whether that's cartilage damage or meniscal damage, and therefore it raises his in-season risk heavily. But in the short term, we do think he has a good chance of being out there and being available at a high level. Then Christian Gonzalez of the Patriots. So he is out. Hamstring averages about 2 to 3 weeks. The thing is, DBs have a high re-injury risk, and they're one of the most common positions to see hamstring strains in the first place. So there's a high re-injury risk if you rush him back, and he's a young player, and that works in his favor, but we would think they want him to be back sustainably. So out this week, we suspect he's out next week as well. Then Tre'Davious White, so he's out with a groin. We don't have a lot of information on severity here, but the average on these is short, 1 to 2 weeks. So depending on the severity here, which we'll find out as he returns to practice, the data would slightly favor him returning to practice over the next week to week and a half. Then Derrick Harmon, he had the MCL injury, and the data here favors him coming back in the next couple of weeks. Usually week 2 to 3 would be his most likely return date. The ramp up from these tends to be pretty quick, so you don't see a lasting performance dip for more than 1 to 2 weeks in most cases. Then Christian Darrisaw. So he's coming off ACL plus MCL. The practice progression here, meaning that he logged a full practice on Friday, does slightly favor him playing at about 55%. It's not a slam dunk, and certainly there is a ramp up period that it takes usually a few weeks for O-linemen to get all their performance level back. With that being said, they are expected to gain it back within that first year. Then Andrew Thomas, a little less optimism on this one. He's listed as doubtful. He's very likely out. The progression of going limited to DNP and then back to limited raises concerns that the recovery is not totally going perfectly smoothly or as intended. And we're suspecting a week 3 to 4 return here, given that he is having this progression even now. He came off the Liz Frank injury. In fact, most offensive linemen would be able to return at this point. But again, we're a little concerned that the recovery is going a little on the slow side here. Then Tristan Wirfs. So the injury reporting on this is a little mixed. He reportedly had an arthroscopic surgery for an injury that didn't heal. We're suspecting an MCL injury, in which case we would lean towards him returning at week 3 to 4. within about 4 weeks, we would expect that to come back to pretty close to pre-injury level. He's also a very elite performer, an elite athlete, so he may be on the faster side of that comeback. And that's all we got for now. Thanks again for joining, and we will catch you soon.